Hello, glorious, lovely, wonderful star seeds. I'm Alexander Quinn, and today I've got Ben Davidson on with me. As you all know, he has a YouTube channel called Suspicious Observers. I think you've got something like 700,000 you've got now, something like that, subscribed
We'll
up to your channel.
probably hit the 700,000 mark in about 2 weeks.
And you put out regular videos. I was just saying before we came onto this, I come from probably a little bit more from a spiritual metaphysical point of view, whereas you're talking about the electromagnetics and the sun probably slightly more from a scientific point of view. But where I found you is because I was talking about some of the stuff in my book, which Dolores Cannon's publisher brought out, and the science is so important behind everything that's going on, and that's how I came across you, and that's what made me reach out and say, hey, look, there's some fascinating crossover here. I also happen to think you're a really funny guy as well. I love your intensity on the videos and stuff as well. And I'm just so glad we could get together today. But before we kick it all off, I think a lot of people are very aware what you do and how you do it. But I'm not conscious of is how did you get into all of this, and how did the whole journey start? Where was it born from?
All right, that's a heck of a story. So my formal training basically should have had me as an agent of the Matrix, trained in both science and business. I also have a law degree. I basically should have just been helping billionaires make more and more money. And for a while I did that. Basically, I'm a research expert. I was in due diligence. So basically I had to understand the legal aspects, the economic aspects of a deal, and then whatever the subject matter was, whether somebody was investing in a mining company, a new chemical entity, new technology. If you're the due diligence lead, you have to be able to handle all of that. Basically makes you a research expert. And law school was helpful there because it's the last place in the world that teaches you how to think rather than just regurgitate information that whoever's standing at the front of the classroom and, just tells you to believe. And after a while, I realized, this is nice. I'm making some money, but I also want to apply these skills to things that actually interest me. So I made a YouTube channel, and they had just come out with something called the Solar Dynamics Observatory. It's the satellite that actually watches the sun. I was like, well, this is pretty cool. And I'm also into earthquakes and weather. So I was like, all right, well, I'm just going to do a little show about the sun, the earthquakes, and the weather. And it became readily apparent after about 6 months that people who watch the sun don't watch the weather. People who watch earthquakes don't watch the sun. Vice versa, that there's no crossover. I mean, the hyper-specialization of the scientific world today is fantastic. That's how a lot of great strides are made forward, but also to step back and have that more interdisciplinary Renaissance view is something that's lost on a lot of people. And it doesn't exist in professional science to the degree it should. And it became readily apparent that, oh my goodness, these things are very linked. Something happens on the sun, boom, earthquake. Something happens on the sun, same kind of weather patterns appear. And it's the kind of thing, it's rudimentary enough that a school child can recognize it, and they do regularly. I talk to school classrooms all the time. And, so there's a nice pairing of the right skill set and a little bit of luck in what I picked to be interested in. And now we just charge forward with how all these things are connected. There's been a bunch of new science coming out. There's a lot of textbooks that contain this information, and never look back from there.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, on a spiritual level, I mean, I think it's no coincidence that you're probably doing this. Is probably part of your, your soul mission, the soul expansion, or whatever people want to call it at this time. Galactically, if you buy into all of that, which of course I do, but I mean, the sun is so important. And I've got a little list of a few scientific things that I wrote down before I came on, but one thing, just to go galactic, just for a minute, one thing that I'm conscious of that I've been following is the idea that we are going into this photonic belt, which is a monastic ring going around Alcyon, because our Earth is going around our sun, but our solar system is also going at some pace on a massive ring around the Pleiadian star system. And I'm conscious that, I don't know whether you've heard of this, that we are going through this photonic area of light, which is also another reason which might be affecting and changing our sun. I don't know whether that's a narrative you've come across.
So yeah, it is. It's actually an electron belt, but I mean, we're talking about semantics here. So photons, they basically go in a straight line. They can curve around a straight line, but they can't be contained in a belt. This ring of electrons is being accelerated and is in such a powerful magnetic field that it's emitting X-ray, gamma ray, other things like that. And so in a way, it's a photon source belt, but the source of those photons is actually the electrons trapped in that field. It's an interesting concept. I am constantly looking for it being spotted in galactic surveys, whether through dust or through their attempts to actually measure proper velocity of stars and other things like that. It's a very fascinating idea. There's still probably work to be done on actually identifying it out in space and actually being able to see it and things like that. There is one that we can see near the center of the galaxy, surrounding what's called the Fermi bubbles. These lobes that go north and south of the galactic center.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so that one we can see fairly well. It's much more energetic.
Do they look like space dust?
Kind of, but they're also very defined lobes, like a teardrop to the north and a teardrop to the south of the galactic center. Yeah, so that one's easier to see. It's vastly more powerful than anything a group of stars would make. It's made by the central engine of the galaxy. And so that one emits enough X-rays that we can see it really well. I think that what you're talking about will really kind of take off the moment somebody actually spots this thing out in space in a way that really can be unequivocally identified as, okay, yes, this is this energetic ring right there around the Pleiadian system.
Because but before we move on to the next thing, what is fascinating about this, this potential Alcine ring or monastic ring, is that it ties in with some of the prophecies from the Hopi Indians or the Mayans and all the rest of it, with that 26,000 year cycle and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting narrative. Talking about cycles, there's a couple of things I want to go through. I was just watching some of your videos before we came on. I watched them anyway, and there was some interesting terminology and stuff that you talk about. That there is crossover, but it's a little bit more scientific in the way you articulate it. And I just want to go through some of it. Is that okay?
Sure.
Now you talk about angstroms. And now they are a very important part of how we perceive the sun and its energy. Could you go into that a bit more?
Right. So it's talking about the wavelength of light. And basically an angstrom is a very, very tiny unit of measure. So if you can think of, and I'll speak in terms that you're more familiar with, you got kilometers, meters, millimeters, micrometers. Somewhere way even smaller than that is angstroms. And we're talking about the wavelength in the ultraviolet range in which we can view the sun. A lot of people talk about it in terms of nanometers. That's not how the satellite is denoted and things like that. But essentially, it's the same basic thing. An angstrom is just a word for this tiny unit of measurement, much smaller than a millimeter, talking about what is the actual wavelength, the distance between the waves of the photons that are coming in the ultraviolet spectrum.
This is particularly interesting for me because you're the only other person I've come across anywhere that I'm conscious of that talks about angstroms. And the reason why it's so particularly interesting to me is because when I'm talking about transdimensional ships coming in and out of our density perception energetically, I don't speak about it in a spiritual way, but I actually boil it down to a scientific reason, also using angstroms going in and out of our transdimensional reality in terms of what we can see in terms of light. So for example, like when you turn on a fan, it speeds up so quick that you can eventually see through it. So I thought it was fascinating when I saw you talking about it as well. And I wonder if I don't know. I'm going to ask you. This is a bit of a theoretical question, but I wonder if we go angstrombly. I don't know what as a dyslexic.
In terms of angstroms.
Yeah, in terms of angstroms. What happens, as we view the sun as we go out of our perceptual reality in terms of what we can see? I mean, I wonder if there's more that we visually can't pick up, and I don't know.
I'm sure there is. It's really interesting to see all the different ways they look at the sun. They can look at the sun in radio waves, in microwaves, obviously in visual light, even with filters to dim down so you can see the sunspots. There are cameras that look in the ultraviolet. There's cameras that look in the X-ray spectrum. Fermi and Swift satellites have even picked up gamma signatures on the sun. When you're talking about something outside of those ranges, we don't know yet, but it's amazing how different the sun looks. I mean, it's still a sphere, but it's amazing how different it looks depending on which wavelength eyes you're using to view it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is absolutely. What is I've heard you talking about a galactic magnetic field. I mean, that just sounds like home to me. So when you're talking about the galactic magnetic field, how does that fall into your purview?
The same way many magnetic fields work. If you can visualize what the Earth's magnetic field looks like with, it coming out of the North and South poles and wrapping around the planet like that, it's very similar at stars. It's very similar at the galactic level as well. And they have done a pretty good job trying to map it. They have done a tremendous amount of work in supercomputer simulations. The observations tend to fortify the results of the supercomputer simulations, which is always important. It's one thing just to have a simulation. It's like, all right, well, you just plugged a bunch of numbers into a computer and had it spit something out at you. When you actually go and observe the things in observational reality, it really helps to fortify a lot of those concepts and allows you to have more faith in the model as a whole, even the things you can't see yet. So let's say this thing has, it gives you the big macro scale picture, but it also gives you little micro details about how the magnetic field works. Well, at this stage, we're only really able to see the big macro picture of the galactic magnetic field. But since it so perfectly matches what the supercomputer model says, it gives one a little bit more faith in some of the micro details. And one of the important micro details of the galactic magnetic field is not only does it have this huge expanse, but rippling through the galactic plane, the galactic equator, is like this wave of magnetism. And that's something that interacts with stars. It interacts with solar systems as a whole. I believe we're actually interacting with one right now. It's one of the reasons why there's evidence of so much change on all of the planets, the sun, the Earth, and interplanetary space, the area between the planets. We're actually interacting with one of these waves from the galaxy right now.
And of course, all of this is based on the model that the Earth is round and not flat.
Correct.
Because if the Earth was flat, and I'm going to try to stay neutral in this before the comments section underneath this video.
Don't do that. Don't do that. Pick a side. Pick a side.
Pick a side. But my understanding is that all these models, and from what I understand, is coming from that the world is round because of the electromagnetics, and that's how they work. So I personally wouldn't understand how it would work on a flat Earth. I don't know, would you?
I mean, how would this podcast work if I was a giraffe? Is there a point to even asking that question? So a couple years ago, I debunked the entire 200-point Flat Earth Bible. I don't know if that's going to upset some of your fans or not.
I'm sure it will. But let's do it.
I've never come up against a single point from flat earthers that I don't just completely tear to shreds instantly. Perhaps the most important thing is myself and several other people have offered to pay for an ultra high altitude balloon that flat earthers can completely control. I don't want any part of it. Don't go hire a professor. We will just give you the money to do this. Go send it up yourself and look. And nobody's taken up myself or anybody else on this offer. But yeah, I can't even envision how this would work with a flat earth, because I can't even imagine how I would do this podcast if I was a giraffe.
Yeah.
Not only that, but I know how the ancients looked at and watched the moon and the sun and the stars and other things like that. And, there's many monoliths that actually show the concentric, rings of the solar system and things like that. How did they know it? It's not like they understood the geometry that they use with sunlight now. It's not like they had spaceships. They understood how to watch the moon, the sun, and the stars, and the other planets for that matter. Forgot that one a moment ago. And they were able to do the math and figure that out as well. And between knowing how the ancients did it, knowing and being able to tell which of modern science is guessing and which is real. I have not yet run up onto a flat earth point that stumps me just yet. Some of the ones are a little easier to debunk than others, but if you've got anything that's rattling around in your head, go ahead and fire it at us. Let's see what we can do with it.
Well, I generally, because of the precession of the equinoxes and various galactic things, I generally happen to fall into the fact that the Earth is round. But also because the electromagnetics and things in the ionosphere and the Schumann resonance, it doesn't make sense for me personally for it to be flat scientifically. So I would probably fall in a similar camp to you. And I just wanted to just clarify that because the models and the science and things we were talking about are based upon a round sphere as opposed to a flat Earth, because there are a lot of people out there that think the Earth is flat. But I do find it interesting when you look out at the stars at night. You don't see lines, you see other round things. So that's just me. But
what do you mean lines?
So if our planet was flat.
Oh, we would expect to see other things tilted at the side rather than they're all happen to be facing us as circles.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I would expect there to be some sort of a randomized distribution where something would appear to be on its side like that. Yeah. An excellent point. I hadn't thought about that.
Otherwise, we'd be the only line in the sky, which would seem a bit naughty, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would be peculiar, for sure.
What I find fascinating about again, so sometimes I'll sit and I'll watch your videos and I'll listen to what you have to say because what is science and what is metaphysics and what is spirituality? Well, in essence, metaphysics, meta for Greek being beyond physics, is only just something that science hasn't quite caught up with. And what is spirituality? Well, if you said, 500 years ago that we were going to be having a chat on a computer and there'd be no time delay and we'd be talking instantly and seeing each other, 500 years ago, people say that's spirituality. So there really is no difference in between spirituality, metaphysics, and science, but science is our current comprehension of what's going on at this moment in time. And I personally love to blend them all together. And that's why I love to watch your channel, because you're right at the front of the science. And also, I happen to love your fiery personality as well, your intense personality as well. But you were talking about something the other day. You're very on, like, in terms of the sun cycles, and there's various sun cycles. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I just love that stuff.
Absolutely. So you've got very short-term cycles and you've got long-term cycles. The most commonly known one is 11 years, 11 Earth years anyway, where the sun produces a lot of sunspots and solar flares, and then it produces very few. And so those are separated into sunspot maximum and sunspot minimum, about 5.5 years from the peak to the trough, and then 5.5 years back to the peak, 5.5 to the trough. Within that 11-year cycle, there's about a 6-month activity cycle. So it doesn't happen. You don't see it as much when the sun is at the minimum, but when the sun is spending a couple years up here, it's actually boom, 6 months, boom, 6 months, boom, 6 months. On longer time scales, there's super flares from the sun, things that would literally throw us back to the Stone Age. Luckily, the last one that happened in 1859, we hadn't really become an electrodependent, really an electrified society at all yet. There was basically some telegraph wires and they all caught on fire.
Oh, that was the Carrington, right?
Yeah, the Carrington event in 1859. But there's even bigger ones that happen on millennial time scales, on the 3,000 year scale, on a 6,000 year scale, et cetera. And it really scales up like that in harmonics. And those are some of the really scary things. Unfortunately, we're about 6,000 years from the last one and are kind of due for something terrible from the sun here coming up in not too long.
And how? I mean, I understand on a sort of quantum DNA level how that may affect us, because I'm conscious that, from an ascension symptom point of view, I feel them coming in my heart, in my chest. When the big ones start coming in first, I feel on a physical level, but I'm also conscious on a spiritual level of increasing spiritual abilities and things coming awake in our dormant, which are in our DNA. But in terms of the sun activity, I mean, what's coming up in terms of the cycle we're in at this moment in time? And also, how do you think that falls into, and I hope we're not going to get into trouble for saying this, but does that fall into a mini ice age, or does that fall into what the globalists are calling global you-know-what, without trying to trigger YouTube from getting involved in this video?
On the 11-year cycle, we are almost up at the peak. So the next several years should be increased solar activity. Concurrently with that, Earth's magnetic field, what I was talking about earlier, is weakening very quickly. This is something that only happens about every, 6 to maybe 12,000 years. And that means that we are exceptionally vulnerable. We wouldn't even need something like the 1859 Carrington event, because our protective interface with energy from space is decreasing and allowing Earth to be more vulnerable to those things. There are several things that the sun could do that would throw us into the next mini ice age, or maybe not so mini ice age. We are actually due for an ice age on an even longer cycle. There's about 100,000 year ice age cycle, where we spend about 90,000 years in glacial periods and then about 10,000 years in an interglacial where it's warm. We've been in one of those for about 12,000 years, which is as long as any have lasted before. And so we are actually already due for a drop back down. It's all really going to depend on how it plays out on the sun. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think it's safe to say that the way that most people alive today have experienced the world as a relatively stable, benign planet is not going to be the case for much longer.
I think that's true. I think that's true. Yeah. I mean, I talk a lot about actually the population of Earth actually starting to really decrease. Personally, is what I see. I start seeing a major decrease coming up now. There are people who think it's going to go the other way, but I happen to agree with that. Yeah. And as the electromagnetic field of the Earth goes down and down and down and down, we're not going to need those. We're not getting those smaller ones are going to feel much bigger. But I guess the question I have for you is, in terms of satellites, electronics, or what the body feels as ascension symptoms and things, what is in your opinion more potentially harmful? A whole load of smaller waves that are going go like that, or one big one?
If it's big enough, a big one is worse. It's not to say that all these little things that are happening aren't having an effect. I mean, even the weakening of the magnetic field itself has an effect. Our circadian rhythms, our cognitive function, the locus coeruleus in our brain, which is responsible for fear, anxiety, panic responses. Those things are heavily influenced by this as well. And so essentially the way things are moving on both the Earth and the sun is causing two main things in terms of how our brains work. And we can go a little bit further into spirituality if you want after this. But one, it's causing problems with the hippocampus. And so we are losing cognition. We're basically getting dumber for the time being. And if you just look around the world, you can kind of see that in general, the world is getting a bit clownish. And then also our locus coeruleus, which makes us have irrational panic and fear and anxiety-based responses, that is going up. And so the scale is kind of being tipped in one direction at the moment. And but you know, what's interesting is we kind of wobble like this, and if you have one tilt like this, it'll snap back the other way. I'm really hoping for that, or else our species is in big, big trouble. We could use a good ascension right about now to something a little smarter, if I can be perfectly honest with you. But yeah, whether that's going to be some giant blast from the sun or, you know, something else like that, I couldn't guess on how that would work. I can tell you that when we have the sudden disappearance and appearance of species, as has happened over time, it's not just that we've had cataclysms that wipe out several species, but several new species take their place. And it's like, well, it doesn't exactly fall in with evolution, because these new species just sort of appear in the geologic record. It makes me wonder if random mutations followed by survival of the fittest isn't the entire story. It makes me wonder if our DNA and our genes don't have certain configurations that they click into based on the energy levels. So if you were to blast the earth with a considerable amount of energy, rather than thinking of a million different potential genetic mutations, it's like, oh, in this energetic configuration, the DNA looks like this. In this energetic configuration, the DNA looks like this. Almost like it's pre-engineered into it to just click into a new gear.
Well, I think some of your ideas and certainly what I'm getting through from the Arcturians is very, very similar. And this is one of the reasons. Oh, hello, that's the Boots constellation.
That's where they're from.
Oh, yeah, man, that's nice. That was a pleasant.
I know a thing or two about them.
Okay,
put it that way.
I like it. I like it. Because what I'm saying, what I've said in my book, what I've got from them is very in tune with what you're saying, and this is one of the big reasons why I thought I got to get in touch with this guy. And clearly now you've got the you know, the Boots constellation on your arm. It's making a little bit more sense. I would love to read who your star family are, apart from the Arcturians and everything else sometimes, but we'll come to that. But I'm assuming that you, within the spiritual community, you have heard all about, you know, the great solar flash, and a solar flash is going to come, and every, you know, suddenly we're going to be in 5D and all this stuff. And you know, I try to say to my subscribers, or the people that I speak to, there's a lot more spiritual energetic complexity to that. I don't know, but what are your thoughts?
So it's certainly possible, but not without a price to be paid. The notion that the world can just be going as it's going, immorality and degeneracy and negativity taking hold across such a vastness, and thinking, oh, we're just going to be saved by some energetic thing from space. There will be a cleansing first. And I don't mean that in terms of like the Hitler eugenics thing. The sun's going to do it. What people call the solar flash is probably more scientifically termed a solar micronova. It is basically a miniaturized nova event. And this is something that absolutely could affect simultaneously every atom of the earth and of the creatures living on the earth as well. And unfortunately, while it could eventually have some pretty profoundly wonderful effects, it's going to be an onslaught to get there. If people think that we're just going to trudge along and then one day we're going to be able to have telepathy or fly through the sky, they got another thing coming. There's, you know, change is very, very hard. Change is very painful. And we're going to pay our dues for what fate or God or whoever you believe, whatever you believe in, has in store for us. Nothing is free in the cosmos.
No. Well, all energy is is just transferred. It just moves from one thing to another. One thing I would love to ask you is if we could just go back to basics a little bit, like kind of sun kindergarten, just for a minute. I love the CMEs. I love the Aurora Borealis. I love these explosions. But could we just go back to kind of sun kindergarten school and just say, look, there are sunspots and we get these CMEs, and how does it happen, just on a basic level?
Okay, so even if one doesn't necessarily even understand anything about electricity, you flip a light switch. Your parents tell you, hey, now that sends electricity to a light bulb. What was dark now lights up. The electrical activity on the surface of the sun is profound, absolutely profound. And it is the connection between, or sometimes even the collision of these electromagnetic forces on the surface of the sun that cause a major flash, something that lights up. And it's not just light that goes out from it, but little charged particles as well. I think kindergarten might be a little early to talk about electrons and protons, but I don't know how many kindergartners are watching you, and a lot of people that do watch you can probably listen to something in terms of electrons and protons. And so similarly, though, when those get blasted out, sometimes they hit the earth. And when those hit the earth and they get funneled to the poles by our magnetic field, it's not unlike the light bulb. You have those electrically charged particles hitting the atmosphere, and they light up in a different way than a light bulb, but they light up as the Aurora Borealis. And it's the same abstract concept as turning on a light switch, sending electricity to something. The electricity hits the little wires and coil inside the light bulb and it lights up. That's the same thing that's happening with solar flares. It's the same thing that's happening with the aurora on Earth, where there's just this electrical connection that is made, surged, enhanced, etc.
And how are the sunspots created? Because am I correct in saying, now this is something I don't know a lot about, the sunspots, but am I correct in saying if there are certain intensities in terms of sunspot randomization and certain groupings, can we look? Is there going to be a CME coming off that, or how does that work?
So it's not an absolute, but we can tell that the more sunspots that are grouped together, and sunspots always have a magnetism and a polarity, either positive or negative. Basically, it means either the plasma is coming out of the sunspot or it's going in. The more of them that are grouped together, the greater chance of a collision between these things. And when they collide, it's the exact same putting things together thing, from the light bulb to the solar flare to the aurora that I just mentioned. You see one sunspot all by itself, it's not that it never flares, but it has a much lower probability of doing so and creating that CME, that coronal mass ejection of particles, than if there's a bunch of them close together and they're morphing around and their magnetic fields are intermingling and entwining and colliding like that. And so, yes, there absolutely is, to a certain degree, an amount of flare prediction that can be made.
Well, my understanding is that in terms of the CMEs and the sunspots, that there's just going to be only an increase. But up until what point?
If you're talking about in time?
In linear time.
So, like I mentioned, we're coming to basically the peak of the sunspot maximum. It's expected to absolutely peak at some time in 2024 or 2025. And then there will be continued activity for another 1.5 to 2 years after that, during which time we will descend for a couple years back into the minimum. And so I would say the most imminent time that we have here would probably be over the next 3 to 5 years, is when we can really expect the sun to be the most active, until approximately 10 or 11 years from now, when it'll be on its upswing back to do this once again.
Because what I am fascinated in is how the sun and its energies also affect what we get, ascension symptoms and the ringing in the ears and all that kind of stuff. And this is not something I've not looked into myself, but I wonder what ascension symptoms will be like, or our DNA upgrades, when the sun starts to come down. Right now, I actually don't know. I haven't looked into it, but I certainly am very aware that what people call physical symptoms or ascension symptoms are certainly very prevalent as it keeps gearing up, because the body is changing its encoding, but also, there's gamma waves and things. So they affect the respiratory system as they're coming in. I don't know whether you ever experienced that yourself personally.
No, not me. I'm solid as a rock. But there have been lots of studies that show, both from immunological perspectives and from the appearance of novel pathogens. A lot of them seem to follow sunspot cycles and things like that. One of the things to be most aware of is the idea is how this is going to affect people's behavior and global cultural, political, social interactions as a whole. This is not only supported by the lowered cognition, the higher emotional instability, the more fear, panic, anxiety reactions, things like that. But this is something that matches up with almost every religion and religious text that discusses these times and what's supposed to happen. Like I mentioned, we are seeing an unfathomable degeneracy in the world. We're seeing a breakdown of traditional moral values, the importance of the family, the importance of even survival, like gender roles.
Yep.
I'm actually a personal believer that there are some aspects of feminism and the change that we've seen the last several decades that is welcome and necessary, just as I recognize that there's individual offshoots that are just going way too far and creating a toxic like situation. And so unfortunately, one of the things we should be looking for is this continued degeneracy of the world, this continued breakdown of morality and ethics, and not amongst everybody. It almost seems like as it's happening among the masses more and more, there's this small contingent of people who's almost making for it in an equal opposite reaction in recognizing what's happening, changing themselves for the better, and trying to be the best versions of themselves that they can be. I do know this. Negativity is more than just being angry or being impulsive or being too sad and depressed. It's also an internal conflict between what you know is right and what actions you choose to satisfy short-term wants. That negative energy is something that's going to be much more harmful. It's going to make your body much more vulnerable to everything that's going on, rather than if you have the more positive energy field for your body that really actually can help protect you, as much as having a good diet, having a healthy mind and body. All of these things are interconnected. So what you put into yourself, your constitution, your mental state, and your decision-making actually have an impact on how much these energies are going to affect you. Some people have a difficult time with that concept, but I like to tell them some people have a difficult time understanding that crystals hold energy and power and things like that. And so do several kinds of rocks. There's no way to deny that it's the case, though. I would say that this is probably going to be the main thing, because as if we don't have a hard enough time coming with what the earth and the sun are going to do, we have to recognize that a lot of the damage is going to be done ourselves, and not necessarily every individual, but by society itself will do a lot of the damage to us before the earth and sun ever really decide, okay, I've had enough of you, species. You think you can change the weather by eating bugs? All right, time to throw you a real curveball.
It's interesting because again, there's a lot of crossover in what you're saying, because on a spiritual point of view, I explain, I say to people, certainly what's presented to me or what comes through when I channel messages from my guys or my guide who looks like that. is that increasingly, although I'm articulating in a slightly different way to the way you're saying, but there's a lot of commonality in that middle ground, is that as these bigger multidimensional energies swarm over us, the ego, it struggles to understand it, and it goes into that fear and that panic. And that's why I keep telling people, come out of the mind, especially as we go into these much higher energies, because the mind will start making some very bad decisions. Got to stay in the heart. And I know it sounds a little bit cliche, but I'm saying the same thing as you, exactly the same thing, if not be it just a little bit from a spiritual point of view. Is there anything else you'd like to say on that before I ask you the next thing that I want to ask you about?
Almost piggybacking of where you were sort of trending with that conversation, there's nothing we can do about the vast majority of the world that is going to succumb to this. There will come a time where friends, people that you love, maybe even can't be reached and can't be helped. And this is where it's important to stay focused and not succumb yourself.
Amen.
At the end of the day, you're not going to be able to help everybody.
It's true. What is a local interstellar medium?
The local interstellar medium is the area just outside of our solar system. So the sun's magnetic field that we were talking about before goes out past Pluto. And just outside of that magnetic field, space is a little bit different. And one of the ways that we actually know, in addition to everything I mentioned about what's the changes inside of the solar system, one of the best ways that we know that we are interacting with one of these galactic waves of magnetism is that the two Voyager spacecraft are actually out there now. Yeah. After 40-something years being launched, they're now finally out there. And it just so happens they were both launched, now one a little bit north, one a little bit south, but they were launched in the exact direction of the galactic center where those waves are coming from,
does one of them have that gold disc on it? Is that the one with the gold disc on it that has a picture of man or something on it?
I think one of them does, but they're noticing shocks, pressure fronts, other things like that, an overabundance of neutral particles and charged particles that from what they would have expected. It's another great source of knowing that, hey, one of these galactic energy waves is actually overcoming and overtaking our entire solar system right now.
That's fascinating. That's incredible. I mean, it's almost like it's kind of almost like an ionosphere outside of our solar system, kind of interacting in that kind of way. Almost, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
You put out a video recently, and I just loved your frustration in the video, because it's the frustration I also have, not so much with the New Age or spiritual community, although I have my frustrations with them as well. But in terms of, you were saying there's no journalism anymore, and you were talking about the plasma filament blowing off the top of. And I was watching your video going, oh, God, thank God there's someone else out there who gets as frustrated as I do. Could you just, in your own words, just run through a little bit about what that video was about? Because I loved it.
So there was a bunch of news articles saying a chunk just blew off of the sun and started to scare a bunch of people. Basically, what happened was something that happens on a weekly basis. The sun has these almost clouds of charged particles and plasma that hang about in the solar atmosphere. Sometimes they collapse down, sometimes they erupt into space. This happens fairly regularly. It happens fairly regularly at pretty much all latitudes, from the north to the south and everywhere in between. It's just, for some reason, these group of individuals who call themselves journalists decide they were going to take this one instance, write a preposterous article, and then spread it around everywhere.
Yeah. I just loved your frustration in that video. And I think that video actually ends with you going, oh, I can't take it anymore, like that. And it was excellent. I loved how you ended on that. Okay, yeah, that was a great explanation because I just want to understand a bit, and in terms of the other thing that's going on that people could say is fear porn. Now, this is something I genuinely don't know about. I have no idea. But I thought I'd ask you. There's a lot of that same sort of journalism going on about how supposedly the molten core of the Earth has stopped or it's spinning the other way and all this kind of stuff. I genuinely don't know because it's not something I've looked into. But do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah. So again, no idea where they got the idea that it stopped or reversed and went the other way. The actual scientific paper that was written, which spurned all of those stories, says that the super rotation of the core stopped to now a just plain rotation. And basically what super rotation means is rotating faster. So the idea was we've got the core inside the Earth and they're both spinning in the same direction, but the core was spinning faster than the mantle and the crust above it, literally by a fraction of a degree. When they looked at the data from several years ago, it began to tell them, nope, they're actually spinning at the exact same rate. There were some scientists who never believed it was super rotating in the first place. They believed you guys just sort of did a miscalculation. We all spin as one. But for the people who did believe that the core was spinning a little faster, now even they must say, okay, nope, now we're all spinning at the same speed. So it didn't stop. It didn't go the other direction. It's just that the super rotation is now called into question of the core. And it's at such a minuscule degree that it really doesn't have any effect on anything at all. Not to mention the fact that if we're being realistic about this, they are basically interpreting seismic waves that go through the Earth. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the bottom of the ocean. Nobody's been to the core. This is all extrapolations based on mathematics, based on best guess of how things actually work down there. And so not only was it bad journalism based on what was actually reported in the paper, but do they really know? I'm not so sure.
I personally have no idea. I personally have no, but I mean, again, they put a lot of stuff out there. They keep putting stuff out there about how all these comets and all these asteroids are coming so close and they're going to hit us and all the rest of it. I personally believe from the messages that I get that some of these are actually celestial bodies. Some of them might actually be cloaked ships, and that some of them are coming and receiving information, actually broadcasting system. But again, we get a lot of journalism that says, hey, some big thing's going to smack us and it's all going to be it's going to be over. So I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that at all.
I know that the scariest near Earth objects aren't added to the list until after they've passed Earth. There's an official near Earth object list, and it's always populated with the stuff that is known about. But, they give it to you, with days into the past and days into the future. And all of a sudden you'll look one day and something pops up and it was like, this one came, just a few thousand miles away. And it's like, wait a minute. 2 days ago, you couldn't have told us that beforehand. And so the ones that they tell you about never end up being scary. The ones that get famous, so in 2013, there was that big one that entered the atmosphere over Russia and exploded in the atmosphere. They didn't
blew up that forest.
Didn't see that one coming. And so it makes me wonder either how good they are at this or how much they actually want to give information about the ones that actually do pose a threat. And then on the journalism side, they're just literally trying to sell clicks and views. It's a shame, but it's the reality we live in right now.
Yeah, it's very, very true. Going forward, is there anything that you'd like to say to my subscribers or your subscribers, just in terms of anything that's coming up in general, or anything that you think that we should really think about, or as a general kind of conclusionary sort of idea going forward in terms of the weeks and the months and this year?
So I take a scientific viewpoint to pretty much everything. But in that same regard, one cannot deny the scientific and statistical significance of the matchup between some of the things that are happening and some of the things that are mentioned in religious texts or mythologies, to the point where, as somebody who lives and makes their decisions based on math and science, I have to start looking at a lot of those texts and saying science and religion are coming together now. And that means that this clown world we're living in right now, it's not going away. It's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. There will be more events like what happened in Turkey last week, more great earthquakes. We're going to have more great volcanoes. The weather's going to keep getting weirder. Yes, the warming that they love talking about so much on the news will keep happening, and ridiculous cold events as well. Record cold, record snow have continued pace right along with the warming. It's like, instead of this, we've got this, bigger swings back and forth. All of those things are going to continue, along with economic conditions continuing to get harder, geopolitical and social situations and relationships continuing to get harder, doing the right thing and being honorable continuing to get harder. But with each test, the rewards get greater. And this is something, basically, it can't be ignored on any scale. People want to know, Ben, should I be more worried about the sun or earthquakes or World War III? And my answer is yes. Not one or the other. We're about to go into the cosmic Super Bowl right now. And hopefully you can handle the pressure, because it's not going away.
Yeah. Very true, very true. And again, it rings into a lot of the things I say. And I'm gonna admit something that I've never said before on a video before, or an interview or anything, but how do I say this? I get information. I channel information. I work with my Arcturian guide, and I only probably put about 2/3 out, really, of the information I get, because some people, it comes in a loving way, but it is also a little bit of a wake-up call, some of it, to say, it's time to get our consciousness sorted out. And it's an inside job. And sometimes these messages will come in, and I will think to myself, if I put this out, people are not going to like me. They're not going to like them. And I'm going to get vilified. And then I'm going to get projected on, and and all these things. I'm so glad you said what you said, because we really are at that crossroads now where it needs to be a little bit more tough love. And I know people say, well, if a channel message, if it's not all pure love and light, then it's not real. But I find increasingly the messages that are coming through are a little bit tougher love, increasingly. And again, it totally matches up with what you just said. We need to kind of grow up a little bit. Come down into our heart, put the ego to one side and get over ourselves. So that's something I struggle a little bit with, whether I should put, some of these really intense messages out. But again, they really, even though some of them are a little bit metaphysical, in terms of what you're saying sociologically, all the rest of everything, it really does totally dovetail. And you have a bit of Arcturian in you as well. So I wonder if our Arcturian is meeting halfway. So, but it's I have to say, there's nothing you have said that I don't see, that I don't receive, and that I don't disagree with. It's staggering how much crossover there is, and yet we're coming from two different places. So, some of the final bits and pieces I've got, just to conclude. In terms of the class flares and the KP index, is that going to start tapering down after a few years' time? Is that what we think is going to happen?
It should, provided that we don't get a major flare that takes out power, in which case, who cares what the KP index is? And we'll have no way to know. In general, this time of higher risk from the sun is over the next couple of years. And then we probably have a couple of years where we can breathe a little easier, not be as worried about solar flares and geomagnetic storms, only to be worried about it again a few years later when the cycle returns. It will be nice when we get back into sunspot minimum to have more of a focus on the geopolitical and the conscious like aspects, because right now and for the next several years, honestly, anytime the sun decides to rock and roll, we could be just a couple hours away from being back in the Stone Age. Yeah. And makes my life a lot more challenging during sunspot maximum as the sun guy. But this is the road laid before us. And it's just like with chess. If you find yourself in a bad position on the chessboard, you can't go back and change your previous moves. You can't sit there and think, oh, I wish a pawn could move this way. You're like, this is what's here. What's the best move I can make? And that's how we all have to look at this. We can't go back. The rules are the rules. Reality is reality, and arguing with it does nobody any good. Just got to do the best we can, because it's not going to be an easy road. Hopefully there's sun shining at the other end of it, though.
Well, the sun is shining. I mean, I was saying on a video the other day, when I tap into the energy now, when I go through my morning routine and I do my grounding and blah, 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 and all that stuff that I teach people, what is present energetically beyond the six senses that we deal with is unlike anything I've ever channeled or got into before. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
So without sound like all doom and gloom, we truly are, the forerunners of an ascended planet, and the actual energetically is incredible. So, we're coming of age and we've got to go, but it's good news. Ben, if there's anything else you'd like to add, I would like to thank you for today. I love your videos. I love your intensity on your videos as well. I love your intense personality. I can be quite an intense person myself. And I thank you so much for coming. And it's been fun. It's just been fun to have a bit of back and forth. And I think you're a great guy. So thank you so much.
Much appreciated. Very much. Thank you. Fun to be here.
Bye-bye for now.